I was born in Montreal, Canada, but left Canada very early in life and moved outside of Boston, coming into a metropolitan area and living with my parents and 3 siblings. And the eldest of my siblings, Mary Ellen, was a person born with some disabilities, which were only discovered gradually during her early childhood. So from the time I was very young, I had the opportunity to experience both the stresses of parents not knowing what would happen with their child who had impairments, and with the very wonderful gift and beauty of having what was called an exceptional sister. So my life began surrounded really by people in community, because my parents became very involved with other people in establishing services for children who had special needs. So I would very often be taking care of the children that came with their parents to meet with my parents, while all these grown-ups decided how to create a future for people who would need special kinds of supports. So I grew up, went to school in outside of Boston, went to college in New York, had a very great interest in peace and justice, and especially social services. So I was working in what are now called very underserved areas of Boston, volunteering in whatever way I could to support families there, and at the same time working with people with special needs, friends of my sister, friends of other people, and finally in different internships and so forth. Then when I graduated from college in New York, I did spend a couple of years in a very special community. Its origins in France, a community of women religious called Society of Helpers, who were dedicated to a very deep religious life, very profound spiritual exercises, and worked very much with the most abandoned souls, both in this world and even the next, referring to those who had died, crossed the threshold in situations of great soul poverty after having lived their lives, also some in great physical poverty. But after a couple of years, I felt a very, very strong feeling that the path into the future was calling in a different direction. And it was actually on the end of the day, the actual day in 1968 of the death of Robert Kennedy, that I moved back into the Boston area, began working full-time with adults with impairments who had no possibilities to leave their home. They were too profoundly disabled to qualify for programs which were still kind of limited in the late 60s. And so a very daring group of people got together to start a first day program. Already the horrors of Vietnam were beginning to show themselves. I became really increasingly aware of that. But then during that time also, through that lens of professional life with people with impairments and handicaps, both physical and cognitive, I became introduced to the Camp Hill movement, an international organization of intentional communities where people live together, often in wonderful agricultural settings, maximizing the potential of each person, many of whom in these communities had developmental disabilities. So in 1971, I was married and able to travel to many of the centers in Ireland and in Great Britain. And after touring and having the possibility to see the scope of the work in several places, I settled just outside of Belfast at Glencraig community in Hollywood, County Down, and lived there between 71 and 72, which was really the a high point of the Troubles as they would come to be known. And I lived in a very violent situation. The village itself, we were a community with Protestant and Catholic children and adults with impairments living together. And so we were considered hands-off by anybody in terms of an extension of the violence into our immediate environment. But the violence, as we know violence does and war does, permeates everyone. And we could hear explosions, we were subject to stop and search at all times. We could see the most peaceful adults with disabilities, children with impairments, suffering things they had never manifested before in terms of behaviors, even seizures of people that never had it, because there is, despite all our rationalizations about distances from gunfire, there is a all-permeating quality to violence. We were very aware of the war raging in Vietnam, and there we were just outside of Belfast in another war situation. My origins are in the south of Ireland, so it was really extremely painful to see the roundup and internment of Catholics without any charges, being subjected to imprisonment and so forth. So after some very extreme, very close to my own life experiences, I returned to Boston, did different kinds of work, went to Oberlin, Ohio, had the opportunity to work with a pastor there in social justice and different kinds of pastoral work, also with the Newman Center at Oberlin College, and founded the first group home, as they were called, for adults with disabilities, being convinced at that point that that would be my path in life, that work. And then had a very profound experience in our little rural cottage outside the town of Oberlin that influenced me very much, that the war in Vietnam was my war, and that the victims of that war were my sisters and brothers. And as I soon became on the journey to motherhood, that the mothers holding their dying children were, that I was that mother. And so after some discernment, moved then in 1975 to Camp Hill in Kimberton Hills, Pennsylvania, a community, not the town Camp Hill, but the movement Camp Hill, a situation there of extended family living where many people in my household were in other situation called disabled or handicapped, but I began to be aware and deeply humbled by the fact that they were the most able of people in many, many ways in terms of social and spiritual development. And then came 1979 and a very serious illness, at the end of which, being very fully a mother of two lively little boys, later to be joined by a wonderful daughter, and living in a very demanding lifestyle, a very nourishing lifestyle, it became clear to me, again through a rather extreme experience, that in terms of the aftermath, though there is really no aftermath to war, it carries on, that I was meant to extend this motherhood to children from Vietnam. And that was 1980. And that was when I met John.
Well, Carrie mentioned that she was born in Montreal, Canada, but she didn't mention that she was born in the midst of an earthquake. And her mother's hospital bed rolled across the floor and hit the wall, and Carrie was born. So this is how she came into the world. Obviously something wonderful was happening and new. And that was September 1st, which is a very significant date, the date in 1939 that Germany invaded Poland, the beginning of the Great Catastrophe of 1939-45. But she was born in 1944, while I was born on May 31st, 1939, before the world had nuclear weapons. I was born in rural northern Illinois. My father was a second generation of German immigrant pioneers in Wisconsin. In 1851, they came from Offenbach, Germany. My mother was the first generation of a Scottish orphaned minister from Scotland. And I had what seemed like a absolutely normal childhood and upbringing. It seemed like there was nothing but happiness and progress. All the questions of facing humanity had been answered. Science was the miracle solution for everything. I really had no questions in my life growing up in the 40s and the 50s. Of course, the 40s was the world was raging at war, and we were going through blackout drills. I had certain vivid experiences of that war, even as a child. Refugees from England, the bombing of England, lived with our family. I remember a U.S. soldier bringing back and showing my father a watch that he had taken from a dead Japanese soldier, and I felt a tremendous chill and coldness in my soul. The 50s, of course, was the peak of anti-communism, McCarthyism, duck and cover drills. But this didn't raise any questions in my childhood mind. I went to college. I was on a path to success. I volunteered for the Marine Corps in 1960, and I enjoyed the challenge, the physicality, the comradeship of other men. Again, no real questions. I had a deferment to go to law school, and so when I was back in advanced infantry officer training in 1965 at Quantico, Virginia, deep soul questions began to emerge. For one thing, in law school I had learned the definition of self-defense, and you can't go across town and kill somebody and claim self-defense. You can't go halfway around the world and kill a country and claim self-defense. But more than that, my first child was born. And so in the nighttime, in the evening hours, I was trying to sing lullabies and to nurse and comfort this infant in my arms. And in the daytime, we were all acting like homicidal maniacs. And this was really tearing me apart. Who was I? Why was I born? Was it really going to be me, a man, to be a paid professional killer, to get in a plane and fly 6,000 miles around the world and kill whoever was in front of me? I came to the conclusion this was not me. I could not do this. And more than that, it was illegal, it was criminal. The destruction of Vietnam and Cambodia, Laos was a crime of unimaginable proportions. So I was able to resign. And I was told that I was ruining my life if I resigned my commission as a first lieutenant in the Marine Corps. I would have no possibility of success in this very militarized American society. And I thought that probably was true, but I could not continue as a Marine Corps officer. I was very happy then to be employed by the college from which I had graduated, ironically a Quaker college, Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. And I felt kind of rehabilitated. And it was then that I read the Warren Report. The assassination of President Kennedy had happened in November 22nd of 1963. And as then being trained as a lawyer and knowing how to evaluate evidence, I read the Warren Report and the 26 volumes of evidence which were in the Swarthmore College Library. And on the evidence itself, it was obvious that Oswald was a patsy, as he said he was, as he told the police he was nothing but a patsy. And that most disturbing thing about this was the bloody public murder, the homicide was, of course, shocked the soul of the nation, traumatized everyone, but then the capacity to cover it up. And the fact that when I began to speak publicly about the cover-up and the assassination in 1965, just 3 years later, I didn't gain the support of the college administration. And the president of the college called me into his office and said, "John, the statistical chances of your changing the public perception of this event are so infinitesimal that your efforts are futile, and you have too much to give the world to waste your time on futile efforts." And of course, I had thought that a college, a very respected college, their highest value would be the truth. That it was an enormous historical question. How were they to teach history? How were they to teach political science? How were they to teach government if they didn't know that the Central Intelligence Agency had assassinated President John F. Kennedy? And so that was another soul shock, this disorientation. Is this college not dedicated to truth, regardless of the statistical chances? Why are we talking about statistical chances about an issue and a matter of truth? I then was offered a position with the Experiment in International Living, whose sole purpose is peace, and that people learn to live together by living together. So they would bring students from Russia and other countries to live with families in this country, and we would send groups to, I think, 20 or 30 different countries in the world to live with families, and not to go as Americans, but to go as learners, to listen, to honor, to respect, to learn languages. And this was a tremendously exciting time in my life. We had Fulbright scholars, Peace Corps returning volunteers. It was my first real touch of the rest of the world, reaching out and meeting and being so impressed by those students who were coming from around the world, and my first chance to go abroad. And I loved that work, but then another great disillusionment or pain developed in my life, in which I began to be physically afflicted. I was in pain for 7 years. I couldn't sleep for 7 years. And the mother of my 3 children abandoned me and took my children to a foreign land. So this was the deepest, in a sense, most intimate and personal shock. And at about that time, a completely uninvited, profound spiritual experience entered my life, which was a voice that was not an audible voice, but a statement that to find yourself, who was I? What is the purpose of my life? Marine Corps, truth, what kind of a government did we have? In order to find yourself, you must lose yourself. So I then began a period of time when I decided that instead of talking, I would listen. Instead of thinking that I had all the answers, I would begin to seek answers. And I began a quest and entered into various religious communities, Pentecostal churches, a Christian Science church, a Benedictine monastery, and began to read the scripture for the first time in my life, and began to enter a life of of prayer and community and Eucharist, the bread and wine and the body and blood of Christ. And that period of seeking was along with beginning my law practice for 5 years in Vermont. And I was law clerk to the future governor when he was campaigning for governor of Vermont, a town of Salmon. It was very good and generous mentor to me. And I could see that path to political success, financial success, but I knew that it wasn't quite the right path for me, because I had begun representing men who were arrested and imprisoned. And I saw that they were the poor, the neglected, those who had never had an opportunity. This was not evil manifest. The petty crimes that they were guilty of were far overshadowed by the horrendous cruelty of the prison system. So here was another challenge. The court's a source of justice, or just another footprint, boot on the neck of the poor, another grave, grave injustice. And I could see it was a grave injustice. So I really couldn't follow that path of the law as though everything was all right. And of course, most shocking, I began to represent Vietnam veterans. And here they would come back and engage in some minor antisocial act. Well, why would they engage in something antisocial? Why were they disturbed? At a young age, 18, they had been drafted, sent to a country they knew nothing about, and engaged in search and destroy missions, burning villages, atrocities and violence that I don't even want to describe, but they would recount to me personally. And so here was the law that had forced them at a young age into the military and into Vietnam, and they came back and engaged in some expression of anger or disorientation, and suddenly the law has them by the neck and they're being held accountable. And I couldn't speak about the draft. I couldn't speak in a court of law about what they had experienced in Vietnam. I couldn't speak about what would happen to them if they were convicted and sent to prison in our prison system. All of those things were ruled irrelevant. So I realized the legal system had a kind of a monopoly on language, a monopoly on communication. Anything that was really, truly, humanly important about the lives of these young men, being drafted, being sent to Vietnam, being immersed in an ocean of kill or be killed, of atrocity, and then coming back to their home communities and being treated like as though they were some kind of dangerous criminal. I couldn't speak about any of that. So I ultimately, after 5 years, felt I had to continue my search. I had to deepen my quest. And because of this inner voice that said, you have to find yourself, you have to lose yourself, I was continuing my life of study, meeting others, seeking community. And I went to live for a year in a Christian community that came out of Germany, the Bruderhof. And of course, they utterly renounced violence. That's the heart and the essence and the soul, the alpha and the omega of the life and death and teachings of Jesus. And they followed it. And of course, we're surrounded in our country with churches that reject that part. They completely embrace violence. And there's no greater denial of love, no greater betrayal of love than violence, than war, than prisons, all which have become so normalized in our culture, when it's just brought us to this ultimate crisis where we face a nuclear catastrophe on a worldwide scale. So this time of a year with the Bruderhof, of course, they reject violence. They reject private property and money. They live lives of simplicity and poverty. During that time, I was healed. physically healed. This pain of 7 years, the atrophy of my right leg, this all lifted, but more than that, my soul, my inner life, my sense of purpose and direction began to be healed. And this community had largely come out of Nazi Germany, so they knew the depth, the suffering, the betrayal that's involved in war and in wealth and in the exercise of power. But because I had felt a responsibility really for Vietnam and a personal responsibility for nuclear weapons. You know, at one time I thought that wasn't my business. I wasn't responsible. How could you blame me? I began to feel, yes, I'm responsible. I am responsible for everything. I live in this country. I am responsible. And I must be, have a witness, have a testimony, have something to say. And so I began to turn towards, I met Father Daniel Berrigan in New York City. He was sharing a Mass at the Catholic Worker Community Mary House in New York City. And I asked to meet him personally afterwards, went to his apartment and told him about my turmoils and my human failures and my seeking for a direction. And he recommended that I consider Jonah House Community in Baltimore, which was founded by Elizabeth McAllister and Philip Berrigan after he was released from prison for the Catonsville Draft Board raid. And so I was not attracted to the peace movement personally. I thought they were kind of rude, crude, and uncivilized. I had a stereotypical view. But of course, I never knew anybody truly and realized what beautiful, gentle, educated, reformed people they were. So that's where the path into the peace movement began, and it began with a 30-day fast, not eating, living on water only, with the great activist and theologian Jim Douglas. Asking Carter and Ford, who were running for president, to renounce first strike, that the U.S. would never, ever attack another country with nuclear weapons. And of course, both of them refused to renounce. They both publicly affirmed the option of using nuclear weapons first. And this was another deep shock to my psyche that the U.S. that I was in a country that actually would carry out, did not, as a matter of policy, have a policy to reject a genocidal nuclear attack on another country. So that deepened my resolve. Phil Berrigan was the first priest, Catholic priest in American history, to be arrested and imprisoned for an act of conscience, burning draft files in 1968 in a statement against the Vietnam War, burning paper instead of children. And when Vietnam was liberated from the American invasion and the bombing in April 30th of 1975, they returned to the focus on nuclear weapons, which had been a focus in this country in the 50s. People knew the catastrophic consequences to which nuclear weapons could only lead. They were not an asset, they were an enormous world liability. And so they began to take up the confronting and the acts of witness, the act of Christian witness against nuclear weapons. And I was part of that. We were often at the Pentagon, at the White House, at the State Department, at the Department of Energy, often being arrested and imprisoned and trying to speak the truth in the courts and to give our testimony from prison. And our friends up at the Brandywine Peace Community in Pennsylvania were vigiling at a General Electric factory that was making the Mark 12A nuclear warheads. And our friend Robert Aldridge, who had been a Lockheed engineer in California, was educating everybody on the fact that these weapons were designed for accuracy, which could only be in preparation for a preemptive nuclear attack. And we didn't really know that the United States had planned a full-scale nuclear attack on Russia in 1962. That's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about. The generals wanted Kennedy to authorize a preemptive nuclear attack on Russia. We didn't know that, but we did know that as they were increasing development of highly precision-guided, accurate nuclear weapons, it could only be for a first strike, because you don't bomb an empty silo. You don't fire second. And being educated on that, and then vigiling in front of plant number 9 of General Electric in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, and recognizing that 600 people were going to work every day with one intention and one purpose, which was first strike nuclear weapons, the Mark 12A nuclear warhead, I began to feel, is it adequate to vigil? Or are we not called to some greater intervention? And observing the plant and the way it was organized and the lack of any high perimeter barbed wire fences, I began to feel that we could enter that plant. We could take hammers to the production process. We could bring the production of those warheads to a standstill, and that we with our lives would say, not in our name. And in the name of God, stop this murderous, genocidal, insane march to world destruction. And so I discussed this with other people in the peace movement, other leaders, confidentially and in secret, because we knew the demons would scream. We knew that entering and taking hammers to production facilities, the demons would scream, the law would scream, some of the peace movement might not approve. We tested the waters. We entered into forming of a community over a period of 9 months of prayer and communion and conversation. And on September 9th, 1980, 8 of us, two women and 6 men, successfully entered plant number 9 and were able to disarm 2 nuclear warheads, which were in an early stage of production. They weren't going to blow up, but we did render them harmless, and we were then arrested and put on trial. And that's where, by the grace of the goodness of creation, Carrie entered my life. And the 23rd Psalm says that, one translation says that mercy and goodness shall follow you all the days of your life. The translation I said that I love is that mercy and goodness shall pursue you all the days of your life. Despite myself, despite my weaknesses, my failures, mercy and goodness has pursued me, and no greater mercy or goodness have I known than Carrie.
So, September 9th, 1980, and I was, as I had said, a co-worker, what we call a house mother, running a part of our community, one of the households, where not only was I living with my own 2 sons and with several adults with disabilities, but also since June of that year, I had received 2 teenage boys from Vietnam, both refugees who had come via Pulau Bedong in Malaysia, and we can come back to that later as the genesis for future developments in life. But I received the news that there had been an amazing event at King of Prussia, which was only about 20 minutes away from us. an area being developed with this huge shopping mall. That's what we identified King of Prussia with. And that this group of 8 people had entered the General Electric plant that formerly had been known only for bringing good things to life, and had disarmed some weapons there. And I discovered that one of them included my friend Daniel Berrigan. I had gone back at the time of my 16th birthday to New York City for a major international conference around the issues of change, social justice, world events, and so forth. And Dan was there. And I was very young to be in the midst of all of that, but had been taken under the wing of a mentor of mine. And I was at this gathering on the night of my birthday, and I heard everybody saying, Dan's going to be coming, Dan is coming. And I asked, who is Dan? And they spoke about their wonderful friend who is a professor of literature, a great poet, and of course a leader, kind of an initiate in the realm of responsibility, human responsibility for weapons of war. So I met Dan that day, and there began a lifelong friendship. So the next morning was the arraignment of the by then known Plowshares 8, and I went flying over to the courthouse in Norristown, Pennsylvania, and there were just a couple of other people there, but a lot of cameras, even from around the world. And I heard in the background these voices singing, this lusty kind of singing, which I recognized to be a hymn. And a peace song followed that, and all this happening. And I turned, and there was Dan and his brother Phil and 6 others, all shuffling along with cuffs and shackles, entering the courtroom, and one of them was Carrie Schuschardt. But I only was focused very much on kind of trying to take in the enormity of the event. I realized something in the world will mark this day as an earthquake, and a moral earthquake. And there was a trembling of hostility and disbelief in the courtroom on the part of the legal system that any such thing could possibly have happened in their jurisdiction, and severe warnings given that there would be consequences. And fortunately, as we know, there were consequences in that more than 100 more Plowshares actions all around the world have taken place, and the earthquake, the aftershock, continues to this day as people confront the demons of nuclear weapons. And John is right. They knew the demons would scream, and the demons did scream, as they do when they are forced into exposure. So I then went back to life in Camp Hill, and kept very close touch, visiting the people at Norristown, and then keeping track of what was happening until then. The following late winter, early spring came the trial of the Plowshares 8. And during that, the world was brought into that courtroom, and Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson, was defending them with others. And I was fortunate enough to be freed from my responsibilities to participate fully in that trial and witness what was happening to the legal system in this world and in this country, and hearing this incredible judge ruling out testimony of the great experts, Howard Zinn, Robert J. Lifton, so many others who assembled there, George Wald, to speak about the threat of nuclear weapons and the planet Earth. I mean, at that point, the question of climate change hadn't emerged, but the annihilation of all climate, the annihilation of the world through nuclear weapons, came so much into focus. So we had testimony on the courthouse steps because it was refused in the courtroom and so forth. So the days evolved. I saw more of John at the distance there and was kind of working as much as I could to be a support to the defendants and to the supporters of the defendants, because I lived somewhat nearby and could supply bread and some food and so forth. And those days ended with, of course, the guilty verdict. I was able to go to interview several of the jurors through another attorney that had kind of arranged that, and see behind the presence of people that had sat rather impassive and stonily in that jury box and were being confronted with what some of them really knew were world-changing ideas and national-changing injustices. So it was a very profound experience for me. I was able to visit John in Western Penitentiary after the sentencing, and was able to then continue the journey of my own family life. As I mentioned, not only Colum and Kieran, but then Ethna, born into our family. And then it turns into the further actions of John, the Plowshares action in Wilmington, Massachusetts, the Avco Plowshares, and then my growing connection with the refugee community, the aftermath, as I said, of the Vietnam War, the starvation in Cambodia, and the world-changing events of that time. My own personal life had changed. I became a single mother. By then I had not only my initial Vietnamese refugee sons, but also the older sister and two younger brothers of Kung joined us. So at that point, we were rather a large extended family, and I was very grateful, as always, to the amazing commitments of Camp Hill to serve those in need of special care. But I began to notice something, that nothing is more handicapping than the environment of war and what it inflicts on children growing up in the midst of violence. They lose everything. War, I began to say, war is the ultimate handicapping condition. But I began to see what the ultimate healing condition was. And that was the interactions of my own children, of course, who were just so selfless, but of these friends with disabilities with whom I had felt so healed always in our community life together. Their unquestioning hospitality and openness to the refugee, their possibility to live with them and speak a common language. My refugee friends couldn't speak much English, although they learned so quickly in the Waldorf school that they attended. My friends in my household, many of them couldn't speak at all, and of course couldn't speak Vietnamese. And so the language that developed was a language of healing, where people met each other face to face, eye to eye, over the abyss that many would think would separate them in an impossible way. So now we come to the magic of community, as it's called. I realized this power of connection between people in need of special care actually being expert givers of special care, and watching the flourishing lives in community now of all my Vietnamese refugee foster sons and daughters. I was really awestruck and really silenced by that, and questioning what is this meant to be? But at the same time, so grateful for the community I lived in and the stability. Stability is the wrong word. It was a farm. Everything's growing and everything's depending on nature and everything's depending on the care of livestock and plants and above all on the care of people. And then came an amazing experience, one really an ultimate experience in this, later in retrospect I could realize, in this series of experiences that would someday come to be known as the House of Peace. And I remember I was walking on the beach one day in a rare little getaway by myself day, very unusual, and suddenly I had this experience, whatever one calls such experiences, that a community was meant to come about, a new community where people traditionally labeled disabled would actually have their abilities used in a special way, namely to help those, serve those, create community with adults with disabilities. So I was really shattered and didn't have any idea what this meant, but I had met the writings of this wonderful woman, Etty Hillesum, who had perished in Auschwitz, a young Jewish woman of the greatest gifts artistically as a writer, who had kept her journals, An Interrupted Life, and finally Letters from Westerbork. And she said we must be a healing balm for all wounds. But above all, she had turned my consciousness in the deepest way toward the children, now adolescents, I was living with, saying, giving voice to them, that no matter whether we survive in body or in soul, but above all in soul, all we are asking for is a say after the war. What we want is the right to a say after the war. And I met then, in fear and trembling, the responsibility to somehow give birth through all the midwives that it would require, to give birth to this community which would be a center somewhere, somehow, definitely by the healing forces of the ocean, where people in need of care would give care, and that healing would be a force, a lively, light-filled force for the wounds of war. So that was pretty daunting, and much to my shock and amazement, my two boys already had some sort of intuition of that and pronounced that to me one day as they were sitting in the back of the car and I was driving on the Schuylkill Expressway. "I think we need to be doing something more, Mom," said Colin, my older son. "And it has to do with kids like Wei and Zia, who were their foster brothers, each in the same grade as Kieran and Colin." So I began to take this idea to my colleagues in Camp Hill and my mentors, Helen and Hubert Zippelin, who had been involved in the earliest days with the founder of Camp Hill, Dr. Karl Koenig, who himself was a refugee from Nazi Germany. They resonated wholeheartedly to this and said, "We will help in any way we can." It then was a rather daunting task to take it to another colleague in the peace work, John, who was out of prison at that point. We were now in late 1989, and who I felt, and he felt somewhere may have a life path would join these forces of destinies that we had, and each of us having had the pain of family life, having gone through major transitions, and then all that John had gone through in his path while I was raising these Vietnamese kids and so forth. So at that point, we began to discuss it, and maybe you could say a little bit of your initial reactions, and then I could continue.
Yes. Well, the vision of the House of Peace is definitely Carrie's vision. It's a woman's vision. It's a mother's vision. And I've always said that no man would have the courage that Carrie had to found the House of Peace. She had no money, and her family was secure and happy and thriving in the Camp Hill community in Kimberton, Pennsylvania. There was nothing really to be gained from uprooting them and setting forth to begin the House of Peace. And I tried to talk her out of it. I said, don't do it. She persevered, and I think it's important to point to some of the astounding things that happened that made the House of Peace come about. One of which is when we found this house, I discovered it was owned by a naval officer, a Vietnam veteran. And so I told Carrie that she should go ahead and write to him and tell him that this was intended for the House of Peace. This wasn't a private purchase at all. It would be a non-profit corporation. The realtor said, don't get involved. I'll handle everything. But I said, no, if he's a Vietnam veteran, he is going to wholeheartedly support what you're doing. And she wrote the letter. The price was dropped by $50,000 in an instant. The rugs were cleaned, repairs were made. It was the most beautiful and extraordinary closing transfer of this property from their family to the House of Peace. And then the House of Peace, it needs to be, strongly stated. You see Carrie and myself, but this is the work of the generosity of literally thousands of people. This need for healing, this witness against war, against the weapons of war, against the direction of predatory capitalism and the materialism of our time, is the aspiration of thousands of people, and we have received thousands of donations, large and small. Some of the large are just stupendous and astounding, which is why we've survived and why we've grown and been thriving. But it's all of that the realm of invisible generosity that you don't see. So that's important to emphasize.
So the seeds had been sown. Reliable seeds are often sown in a fertile soil that's watered with tears and some pain and all the things that came toward us and had grown within us seemed to call for taking the great leap, and so we did. And the final part of the decision making for me, because I did pay attention to what John said, that it was a major disruption, and of course we did have no money and all of that, was a retreat I made at Easter on the Isle of Iona in 1989 to make the final decision, is this the call? And in those days it became very clear through many outer and inner experiences, yes. And on Easter Sunday, I was walking back to the little place I was staying on Iona, and I saw in the wind this board swaying with the words Tai Chi that sounded so beautiful. Tai Chi, I wonder what that means. And I came back to this very minuscule, detailed map I had of Iona, And there was the word Tai Shi, which meant house of peace. So on that Easter day, it became a reality and rose from the womb, the tomb, into reality. In June of 1990, we arrived with John's van, which had all the bicycles strapped to the top, and 2 U-Haul trucks, and my ever so brave and noble kids, and several helpers. And I'm sure all the neighbors in the historic district of Ipswich were watching for what enormous moving company would fill these 19 rooms worthily, because the house, the Rogers Manse, is a great treasure of Ipswich history, almost 300 years old, built by Nathaniel Rogers, a great pastor to the First Church in Ipswich, and the home of the Great Awakening, welcoming people who were refugees of religious persecution. When we arrived with our U-Haul trucks and our bicycles and unloaded, that didn't take very long at all. Many of the rooms were totally empty, but as John said, the house was filled with a welcoming spirit and mood and beauty. And we began our work. And we didn't know anybody. We knew that we were by the ocean. We knew we were by a Waldorf school, which was a great commitment to my daughter, that her education would be in a Waldorf kindergarten through 8. We weren't able to have high school Waldorf for the boys, but they flourished at Ipswich High School, which has been an incredible support to all our work. So people found us, and they found us right away. And through Lutheran Children and Family Services, with whom I had for years, since 1980, been a qualified, certified foster parent, we began to receive young people. We already had 2 adults with disabilities living with us, plus my 3 children and my 2 Vietnamese children, and then a wonderful approach by the agency. Would we take an Amerasian? There was a major effort to bring some Amerasians, children from Vietnam, to America. So in November of that year, John talks about my courage, I talk about his. We were married in our tiny little chapel here, and the next day we had 3 Amerasians, plus our Vietnamese children, and there were 8 children floating around the house, and it was all very demanding. So those first years, the first 8 years, 90 to 98, we took unaccompanied refugee minors, and it was very, very intense, mostly teenage boys from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Cuba, Vietnam, El Salvador, all victims of war one way or the other, very traumatized. They went to Ipswich High School. Most stayed for the duration of their academic work in high school and then moved on, some to college. The Vietnamese part of the family went on, some to pharmaceutical school, and of that contingent, many have become doctors. Then came a very diminishing of that program of unaccompanied refugee minors at the time by the State Department, just when the influx of refugees from the war in Bosnia happened. And so we had many families through Catholic Charities come with the services that are organized for them by Catholic Charities, so their stays were mostly shortened, and they were able to find safe haven here until they could find their own apartments and begin to get jobs. So we became a great supplier of furniture and kitchenware and bedding for countless peoples from Bosnia, then Kosovo, then Sudan and Somalia, and war by war, country by country, people came here, always being met by our core community of people, some of whom, as I said, were adults whose gifts of hospitality were greatly heightened by the selflessness that this cloak of special needs seemed to wrap around them, and the sharing of their lives together with whoever would come. We worked with different agencies. We had our beloved Joseph move in, who couldn't see, couldn't speak, was very sclerotic, and was the first one that people would turn to. Joseph, who was ready with a handshake, unable to tell the color, the origin, the country, unable to worry about any language restrictions because his very simple, somewhat guttural sounds conveyed such heartfelt affirmation of the other. But then also both my parents, who had come to live here with my sister Mary Ellen, soon after their arrival, very soon after, my father died, and of a sudden illness. 10 months later, my mother died. And so I had the opportunity, after so many years of being off doing work, but keeping, of course, in close touch with my sister Mary Ellen, of having her enter into full community as well as family life together with me. So we then also had individuals coming, seeking political asylum, some underground, some outside any system of help, others involved with agencies. People always ask us, how do people find you? And we just have to say there's just this, what do we dare say, a kind of cosmic energy in this world, as you know, as we all know, that brings people who are meant to meet each other, that brings people together. And so the aspect of our work, living in community with adults with special needs, with the second aspect of serving and healing the refugee, who becomes then a mighty pillar for peacemaking, a voice against war, and a powerful presence for peace in the world. Those two aspects flow together in a wonderful way. Always, this is in the context of the peace and justice work, which the House of Peace became a kind of center for in the very, very early days. And so maybe John could describe the founding of the Veterans for Peace Samantha Smith chapter and the North Shore Coalition for Peace and Justice, and our work with other peace agencies, peace aspects of the peace movement around this area and beyond.
Again, an invisible, perhaps, aspect as we talk and try to tell this story are the stream of volunteers, students, interns, co-workers that have come continuously. Now we're into our 30th year, and they have been a huge and central part of the House of Peace. They give a great deal. They also meet the world. They meet the suffering of the world. They meet war and the victims of war. And we've heard from so many of them that this was a turning point in their life, and that it changed the course of their life. So we're very humbled and grateful for that, the significance of that. Our life, our community life, I'd like to say, is never turned inward, but always outward. And the relationship with other communities and the peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement, movements for equality and against the violence of prisons, the violence of war, the violence of our criminal injustice system, is all a part of the House of Peace. So we keep a close relationship with communities such as the Catholic Worker community, the Atlantic Life community, the various communities across the country and really in other countries that are part of a large and swelling and ever-present voice in our world, which is not given any publicity, not given. If anything, it's always denigrated, it's always dismissed, it's always eliminated from the news, it's always misrepresented. But it's strong and growing, and we're a part of that. The Veterans for Peace chapter was founded here in November of 1990 and named for Samantha Smith, the courageous 13-year-old girl from Maine who wrote to Reagan and Drop-Off about asking why they wanted nuclear war. And our founder, Captain Paul Brailsford, who was a ship's captain for his career, was inspired by Samantha Smith and said we should name our chapter for this courageous girl, which we did. So Veterans for Peace has met here every first Saturday of the month for a breakfast meeting now, going into our 30th year. The North Shore Coalition for Peace and Justice was formed when the U.S. was on the verge of destroying Iraq for the second time in 2003. In 1990, we had destroyed Iraq the first time, and of course the destruction, the occupation, the cruelty against the people of Iraq continues to this day. So Veterans for Peace and their goal of the abolition of war, there is no alternative. It's the only option. Humanity must rise up with a unified voice to abolish war. Is a central theme and a central aspect of our participation. We organized the National Convention for Veterans for Peace in 2004 here in Boston. We participate in many Veterans for Peace activities, and they have come here on many occasions for retreats. So we're deeply connected with the Camp Hill movement, the community movement that Carrie was in and remains a part of.
Peace Pagoda. Peace Pagoda too.
We are deeply connected with the Peace Pagoda, the Japanese Buddhist monks who have been praying with the prayer drum around the world, again warning humanity that nuclear weapons must be abolished, that we are clearly on a course of self-destruction. And they built the first Peace Pagoda with our help and participation overlooking the town of Amherst. There's a second Peace Pagoda being built overlooking the nuclear weapons factory at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, currently. So they are a deep part of our life. They have a deep connection with the Wampanoag people and with Native Americans. Dennis Banks, the founder and leader of the American Indian movement, has come here. And White Feather, a Ojibwe spiritual leader who disarmed a nuclear missile silo out in the Western Plains and was imprisoned for that, was here. Helped us dedicate the back hill as the Agawam Peace Summit, dedicated to the Agawam people, the original people here, towards a vision of peace. So it's these wider networks, and we are students of Rudolf Steiner and part of the anthroposophical movement, which is also a vibrant movement seeking to awaken humanity to this self-destructive course of materialism, of refusal to see these invisible spiritual realities of our life and our world. Dr. Steiner saw the catastrophe of 1914-18. He predicted the disaster of Bolshevism, that 1914 and 18 would be only followed by, as it was, a far greater catastrophe of 1939 to 45, which was then followed by the far greater catastrophe of implanting genocidal weapons in 9 countries around the world on hair trigger. So as Regis Films points out, we're 3 minutes to midnight, or maybe 30 seconds to midnight. And the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is warning us as loudly and as clearly as possible that midnight is fast approaching humanity. So anyway, I want to indicate that what happens here under this roof is only because of our vibrant and ongoing and continuous engagement with all of these other communities of similar aspiration and courage and determination to awaken a country that is gripped by illusions, by untruth, by violence. And I want also to mention that, you know, I am personally kind of a student of Dr. James Gilligan and his wife Carol Gilligan, who was a leading researcher into the wisdom of women, and that violence is tragically a male predilection. It is from the feminine, it is from the woman that comes life and nurture and healing. And that is why the House of Peace was founded by Carrie. Why conversion must come through men renouncing violence. That strong men don't bully and strong men don't kill. That's not why our mothers bring us into this world. It is a massive untruth that joining the military will make you a man. It is personality suicide. It is soul suicide to allow yourself to be brainwashed and conditioned and hardened, and your emotional life killed, to become a soulless, violent, professional killer in whatever branch of killing you may be engaged in. The Air Force high in the air where you don't see, and the drones where you don't see, the naval that you don't see, or on the ground where maybe you might see the unbelievable carnage and bloodshed and brutality and cruelty, and as Eisenhower said, the stupidity of organized, legalized violence.
John has said so powerfully what the consequences of the catastrophe of violence and war are. At the House of Peace, dating from about 2006, we were asked to take children that were severely wounded, burned, or otherwise harmed from war zones. Those children are being brought to hospitals in Boston for free medical treatment and need hospitality while they're here in a very special and protective way, and then they return with their parent or caregiver who is with them to their country. And so, after having large families for all those years, having individuals, we have begun a steady procession of the children on the ground who manifest in every inch of their body these consequences of war. Children basically from Iraq, though we've also had a child from Gaza, we had a child from Congo, but mostly these Middle Eastern children have brought to all of us who have the privilege to meet them a direct experience of what that pilot cannot possibly know, or what the statisticians of collateral damage will never know. And we have often said, if the war makers could possibly spend one day in the life of such a child, preferably during their surgical treatments and aftermath, they would think very, very carefully about new ways to end the war and the violence and the catastrophe that this world is now in the midst of, in a way we never 30 years ago when we started ever could possibly have imagined. We're engaged in a time when the refugee is marginalized, condemned, persecuted, walled out, starved, incarcerated. And we have a moral responsibility with every resource that we possibly can muster, both inner and outer, to meet the needs of those people and change the hearts and minds and souls of those whose policies are constantly creating the world moving masses never before seen. The House of Peace is tiny. Over our years, we've had more than 500, more than that, people live with us full time, some for many, many years. We've had thousands and thousands of visitors. It's a minuscule microcosm of the suffering of the refugee in this world, of the child victim of war. We also said we can never serve the victims of war without realizing that the veterans are the victims of war. And so the community has expanded. And John has mentioned one of our teachers, our fundamental focus on this word, the wisdom of the human, anthroposophy. Just as Camp Hill grew out of that stream, so has the House of Peace committed to it fully from the very first moments. It's all about becoming human and about extending new forms, practical, urgently needed forms of therapy and healing to a world that is really broken. When we started, we had some principles and purposes, only 7, and they tried to encapsulate the intention of the House of Peace. Perhaps the section of that most appropriate is to say, we hope to confront the suffering of the earth and its displaced peoples with a thought of the heart manifested in community life. Our pillars from day one have been gratitude and trust. Gratitude toward the uncountable thousands of people who know of us, who have lived here, who have contributed in order to make it possible for people to live here. To those children whose lives have been so impacted by war that we can't walk away, we can't not see them, we can't not reach out, whatever it is that we can do to help heal, but above all be open to the healing and wisdom that they are meant to convey to us. And finally, that other pillar of trust. We're in uncertain waters. People are trembling with fear. People don't know what this nuclear clock ticking means for them. People don't have a sense of security and are flailing about with artificial means of homeland security. We know there's no such thing as a security that is based on a nationalism that only demonizes the people of other countries. We know that our true security lies in the trust that when communities of people come together with the effort to purify intention so that it is really an intention to offer to the world and its displaced people a thought of the heart, a thinking heart, as Eddie Hillesum said, a practical heart, a heart that will reach out and touch those that are suffering the most in order that the war and violence of this world that those forces of racism, those forces of materialism, those forces of economic greed that Dr. King spoke about will be obliterated, and we can say obliterated by a real avalanche of those who would bring down the good and create a true culture of peace. Another aspect in terms of our reflection over our commitment and life together with children of war relies entirely on the personal experiences John and I have had at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Each of us initially brought there as part of delegations with the Buddhist monks of Nipponzan Hoji. In my first trips to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 2005, John and I brought an apology on behalf of the American people for the Holocaust of the nuclear genocide. And it was on that trip in 2005 that I went to the epicenter of that second atomic bomb at Nagasaki, August 9th, 1945. I went to Urakami Cathedral and met what's called the Hibaku Maria, a Madonna who had been loved and completely inserted into the religious life of the people of Nagasaki. She was reduced to ruins amidst the cathedral ruins after that atomic bomb. But the head of this Madonna was somehow rescued by a Trappist monk who discovered her in the smoldering ruins. And she has had a long history of being marginalized because it's so painful to look at one with radiation burns, an image of the nuclear dawn that she witnessed. But now she resides in a beautifully constructed chapel adjacent to Urakami Cathedral. And I have begun to see what a healing power, as John says, this feminine principle, this Maria Sophia, is for the wars of this world and the wounded of this world. And we owe a tremendous amount in terms of the growing consciousness of the House of Peace to the Hibakusha, those who have suffered the nuclear holocaust of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who help us in our work. Never again. Never war again.